Um, Welcome, everybody. In order to keep to time, I think I have been asked to introduce our very distinguished speaker today. Um, we are really very honored, and I speak on behalf of all of us at the Kerala Council for Historical Research, that Professor Amit Bhaduri has agreed to start off our new series, new lecture series called Interventions. The idea behind this lecture series is that we get historians and social scientists to engage with ongoing contemporary issues. And the context in which we had asked Professor Bhaduri to speak to us today was the ongoing farmers' protests. Professor Bhaduri really doesn't need any introduction, but for some of our young students, just a few sort of significant things about Professor Bhaduri. At least speaking for myself, I associate him most with my university, Jawaharlal Nehru University. But he was educated at several very distinguished places like Presidency College in Calcutta, MIT, and Cambridge University. And he's also taught in several places, including the Center for Development Studies in Trivandrum, Jawaharlal Nehru University, of course, but also Stanford University, Bremen University, and he's has been given an honor of an extraordinary scholar from Pavia University in Italy. He has written widely, and I am not an economist, so therefore I cannot speak with any degree of knowledge to his really big contributions, but I have read him for several years in his public political and other engagement that he has made continuously for several years in the press. His major academic publications include The Economic Structure of Backward Agriculture, The Dynamics of Commodity Production, Unconventional Economic Essays, Employment and Development, and most recently, The Face You Were Afraid to See, which is a wonderful title. So on behalf of KCHR again, Professor Bhaduri, maybe invite you to speak to us about commercialization of agriculture in theory, history, and contemporary Indian politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Is it all right? Everybody can hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes, okay. I am very grateful for this invitation and the chance to be able to speak to many historians, and particularly in Kerala, which is one of the places where I taught for at various phases in my life. And it is always good to know that Kerala academic scene is thriving and they're willing to listen to somebody who is a bit off track, both as an economist and certainly as a historian, and on top of that, a mathematical economist also. So basically, I would start by apologizing for two things for a group of historians, which is, I suppose, a dominant group of historians. The first is my severe lack of knowledge of the history of land tenure in south of Bengal, or what we usually call South India, and more importantly about Kerala, which was an old princely state, and how its land relations changed, developed and so on. I know a little bit, but very little, and I hope some of the at the moment listeners will later speak, saying that what is different or similar in the South. My second apology is not being a professional historian, I have written a couple of things in economic history, but not being an economic historian, I always use only secondary sources, but various secondary sources, and also first-hand information from my field research. Field research is not the word. When I used to move around in certain parts of Eastern India to see what is the condition of people and basically what is the condition of people, and therefore I had to see what is the condition of land. I collected some first-hand impression, which is far more valuable than data. And this has strongly influenced by research. And these areas where I traveled were mostly in the colonial administration, the zamindari areas. Now, today's topic, I think, is of almost universal interest, certainly in developing countries, and has been in developed countries, which is what you call commoditization or commodification of agricultural products. But already it is a wrong statement, because what actually happened is not only commodification of agricultural output, for example, which is the main thing which is going on now, about how do we look at the 3 agricultural laws hurriedly passed by the government. But there is something more important in the whole notion of commercialization of agriculture, which typically historians, economists, and other people, sociologists, all of them, those who describe it when they give a first-hand account, or say, for example, a sociologist. But it is not something which is sufficient comprehensively in the analytical structure. So let me start from there. You see, commercialization of agriculture is not simply commercialization of the agricultural produce, what we call the agricultural products today. Commercialization involves several markets, and in agriculture it includes, for example, land, it includes labor, it includes credit, and it includes, the working capital, the raw material, the inputs needed for agriculture. All these together get, and of course, the product. So to say 4 or 5 markets, major 4 or 5 markets: land, labor, fixed and working capital, that is then credit, and product. All these markets, how they move in relation to one another, is what commercialization of agriculture is. Now, let me give you 2 examples to make this clear. The first example, for example, is Marx, who greatly influenced the way people think of history, historiography, and so on. Marx, for example, had, his classic work, Capital, starts basically from what is a commodity, the very first chapter, commodity, alienation of labor, etc. But Marx's basic, so far as commercialization of agriculture was concerned, I will come back to it again. Basically, Marx was interested not in the development of capitalism, in which it was the commercialization of the labor market. That is how labor becomes a commodity. This is what actually, and how labor becomes a commodity by, disposition, so on and so forth, which was basically made one kind of view of what is commodification of labor. Another view, a very famous Polish historian, some of you might know the name, one of the great historians of the 20th century, Witold Kula, and several of his followers and so on. He, for example, looked at feudal agriculture as the same sort of thing which Marx was thinking about, and he was also influenced by Marx. But he was looking at how the feudal Europe, rather Eastern Europe, not England, Eastern Europe, moved towards the market. And he, for example, gives my favorite example. He said, for example, Poland had lots of trees and had lots of timber, but timber was not a commodity. So the landlord would use any amount of timber for even small things. They will throw away timber, they will use the most expensive timber because there was no market for timber. And similarly, for example, you had, Mughal India, medieval India, in northern India, in the Mughal Empire. There are plenty of historical evidence of labor being not a commodity in that sense. Simply any amount of labor would be used, where about 1/3 the labor could be used. Some people actually say that one of the marks of feudalism is the excess use of labor, which significantly comes down with capitalism. But anyway, let it be. But this tells you, if you think of Marx and if you think of Witold Kular, you actually get an idea that there are different approaches to history, different approaches to the notion of commercialization in history, or what you call historiography. And one of the approach is to start from the labor market and to see from the labor market how its impact comes to various other, like in Marx, commodification of labor theory of value, and all this is based basically on a historical process of labor becoming a commodity, to be bought and labor power becoming commodity, to be bought and sold in the market. On the other hand, you also have other historians who actually started by saying what is the product market, how things get settled. But in between, there are also other markets. And it is which market gets commercialized first. The sequence is what is usually missed. That is, the sequence can be very different in different historical circumstances, in different historical contexts. You can start from depending partly on your problem and partly on the period you are studying. You can start from a labor market and you can see how the labor market develops. For example, among Indian economists, historians, and so on, Utsa Patnaik, said that Punjab agriculture is very capitalist because she was basically looking at the labor characteristics of the market. On the other hand, there are other people who were looking at, like Dharamnaran in India, who was looking at what is the proportion of output which is sold to the market. When a high proportion of the output is sold to the market, you can say it is capitalism. Others said when a high number of workers are wage labor, it is capitalism. So you can, depending on which market you are looking at, in what context, you get an answer which is different. The first point to remember is that it is the sequence of these 4 or 5 major markets, land, labor, capital, credit, which in what sequence they become commodified, or in what sequence they become buying and selling as commodities in the market. You have actually the basis of agriculture. And this is not a linear process. And the reason why it is not a linear process is one of the things on which we work. Why there is not only one unique way in which it goes, is because these different markets are linked. These different markets are linked, and the very process of commercialization links them. This is the thing in which, for example, some of you have been students in JNU, in which, for example, Krishna Bharadwaj, whose daughter also many of you know, Sudha Bharadwaj. Krishna Bharadwaj, for example, worked on and I also worked on, how you have a connection between different markets, what we call interlocking of the markets. Now, the fact that you have different markets which move in different sequence, and these different sequences are connected by interlocking among them, is what makes the problem so interesting and complicated, and historical research so important. Because it is only through historical research that you know which sequence you are trying to catch in which particular context. As I already said, Marx gave one example, Vitold Kula gave another example. There are many other people who gave other examples. But let us see what we can say about the Indian context from this perspective. Well, the colonial land revenue system, which actually maybe are taken as a cutoff point, really created three systems of land revenue, three systems of land tenure and land revenue. One was the Eastern India, where the colonizers settled, and this was what was at that time used to be called the Bengal province. It included Bihar, parts of Eastern UP, so on. And this area, the Zamindari area, basically had land settlement where the Zamindar, the ultimate owner of land was, of course, the crown. What you call the eminent domain, which even today continues in more or less the state owns the land. But the state actually leased out the land to the Zamindar. Just like in the Mughal period, the emperor leased out the land, or leased out was not the word, the emperor allotted the land to various local feudal lords, who in exchange, gave him some rent, tribute, and who also promised to provide an army, raise an army and provide an army whenever the emperor needed it. This was roughly the cornerstone of the feudal North Indian system, Mughal system. Similarly, this more or less continued in the Zamindari system. There was no army, the army, of course, but basically land, the eminent domain was of the British Crown, but landlords were the superior tenure holder. They were given the lease to the land, and they had to pay rent. Now, and they paid the rent then in the Zamindari area by giving out the land to very many people under them who had sub-tenure holders who held under them. And they in turn gave tenure to people still under them. A whole hierarchy of tenure holders were created. And I don't know how much of this held in the south of India. A hierarchy of tenure was given directly under him from the Zamindar down. And each one paid rent to the one above them. So ultimately, the ultimate producer, say, for example, by the early 19th century, when we have fairly good reports and data, late 18th, early 19th century, what you had was a very, terrible system in which the direct producer, on an average, anywhere between 8 to 11 higher tenure holders existed. Now, this means that 8 to 11 layers of rents were paid, and part of this rent went to the Zamindar, and the Zamindar paid rent to the British Crown. And if the Zamindar failed to pay rent to the British Crown in time, there was a law which was called the Sunset Law. By the sunset of a certain date, the land was could be taken away from the Zamindar, and auctioned out to somebody else. And there are lots of stories in Bengali, novels and stories in Bengalis about the zamindar, the desperate zamindar trying to meet the sunset law. Just like at the other end, there are many stories of the very poor peasant who is at the bottom of the thing and trying to pay rent, not directly to the zamindar, but one of the tenure holders of the zamindars very often, who is collecting rent in the name of the zamindar. Now, this was the zamindari system. I said something about this because this was in contrast to the other land tenure, two other land tenure systems which the British created. The other land tenure system was Rajvari system. The area which you see of Western UP today, quite a part of Punjab today, which you see, were areas where you had the Rajvari system. The Rajvari system basically said that there was no zamindar. It was a direct tenure holder. The Rayat was a person who actually had to pay the rent to the crown directly. And he was more or less a middle peasant. The modern representative of this was Chaudhary Charan Singh, who carried out the land reform in India in 1955, one of the men. He was a great Jat leader, and and right now you have the Jats joining the Sikhs in one of the movements. But the beginning of the rise of the Jat groups come from the Rajwari system, which is of much of Western UP. And the third system was a system which you call the Mahaldari system. Punjab and part of which is now Pakistan, part of the northwest undivided British India, was the Mahaldari system, where the rent had to be paid neither by the zamindar nor by the direct cultivator or the Rai, the middle big cultivator called Rai. The rent had to be paid by the community. And that is why it was called by the Mahal. That is why it was called the Mahaldari system. But this system did not function well because, it became a problem of who pays how much, how would it be organized within the right. But it has a very interesting historical long shadow in the fact that what you see today as what you call, the panchayat, the mahapanchayat and so on, which is far more well developed in West UP, in Punjab, in Haryana. I mean, panchayat and so on exists everywhere in India, but their caste system, their political system, all this got very much linked with the fact that the rent payment was originally supposed to be collected to that system. The system did not continue, and most of this became a Rajwari system. In Punjab, for example, the British had the settlers. Who actually came back to the system and created the, just 1 minute, I think some telephone. Hello. I'm very sorry, somebody tried to call on the landline. Anyway, the Mahaldari system of North India very soon got, changed over to basically something close to a Rajwari system. Punjab, many of the people who came back from the First World War, the soldiers of the First World War, were given land and they become along the canal. They were settled as settlers in Punjab as rights, basically as rights. So this is the area which you see where, for example, today's, the farmers movement, and that is why you call it not a peasants movement, but a farmers' movement. They were actually originally started by ryots who were middle large peasants. I mean, not zamindars, but large peasants. Now, this system created a very important contrast, and I think which is what historians study usually an area. Very often they are guided by the primary source material which they have got, and of course a general narrative of history, which most people. But what very often is not noticed, and this was one of the main, well, if you like, one of the main theses or one of the main ideas which I tried to emphasize in my writings in various ways, was that you see, basically you got two different kinds of developments which took place in the whole of North India. Starting with the DNA, the original history of the Zamindari areas in contrast to the Rajvari areas. In the Zamindari areas, as I already said, because you had this whole layer of rent collectors, basically, in the middle, between the Zamindars and the direct producers.
I think Professor Bhaduri has got disconnected. He'll reconnect with us. You're on mute, Professor Bhaduri.
Microphone on. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay. Now, as I was saying, what has not been noticed either very much by historians or by economists is the fact that the area which was the Rajvari area basically had a development where you had middle peasants and more or less the commercialization of agriculture was the middle peasants produced, and whatever surplus they produced, they sold to the market. And they had the usual, with them gradually developed all the other usual symptoms, the labor market, what shall I say, of wage labor. With that also grew the credit system, but the credit system was much more based on the farmer's need for credit and selling. It was much more like a, what shall I say, closer to a, not much more like it, but it was closer to a usual development of the market, of the type which what I mentioned, people like Witold Kula had talked about, that the whole movement was to make the agriculture produce a commodity for selling a surplus agriculture produce to be sold in the market for money value. In the eastern region, you had a system where, if you want to say it simply, you can say the opposite. That the whole commercialization was driven first by rent collection. Historically, first by rent collection. Because what happened was the zamindar's rent had to be paid. So for the zamindar to pay the rent, the zamindar collected rent from people below him, other rent collectors. Those rent collectors collected what we call chotedar, for example. They collected rents from people below them, and collection of rent was the original driving force. But as rent was collected, all rent was basically collected from the direct producer at the bottom. The direct producer got into very severe debt almost from the very beginning, because everybody wanted a higher rent from him. And everybody wanted to pay. Zamindar had to maintain his standard of living, and therefore he wanted higher rent. The people below them had the same reason they wanted this. And the person who took it all was who absorbed all the shocks, so to say, of this higher and higher demand for rent, was the direct peasant at the bottom. So you had an impoverished peasantry of a type which originally the Rajvari system did not produce until land subinfeudation started taking place. The result of this was that product market got commercialized, like in the North India also, more was sold. But first it was sold for rent, and second, the people who produced were not selling for rent. They had run into debt, and they were selling their product to settle mostly their debt and their rent. Their debt and their rent settlement more or less took the lion's share of their output, and they were indebted beyond that. And so it became for them, in many of them, which I have seen with my own eyes, for many of them, it was a perpetual debt cycle. They were trapped completely in debt. Every year they produced, right after the harvest they sold at a very low price, or price which was already decided before, because with the person to whom they were indebted. And usually they were indebted by the time we came to study the areas. They were indebted to the people who were the immediate people above them. One big change which took place was, of course, independence and land reform which took place. In Eastern India, in the Rajwari areas, the very high riots, the zamindars or the thakurs, or the native princes and so on, they were all pro-British. If you read, for example, Nehru Discovery of India, if you read, one of the things was that all the big landowners, the landed aristocracy, whether it is in Rajasthan, which was the most acute of this, or in Western UP, the Thakurs, they all simply were eliminated as the pro-British with the compensation. This was the Chaudhary Charan Singh's land reform, and which more or less was completed by 1955. So basically, Western India, you had the big riots, and the big riots the really high riots comparable to the zamindars and the native princes. They were more or less all compensation, and land was taken away from them, except for that later thing which Indira Gandhi did. And much of the middle riots who actually cultivated remained, and they very often gave cultivated land either through sharecroppers or through wage labor. But they maintained a direct connection with production, and most important from our point of view, economic point of view, is they produced a surplus. They had agricultural surplus, and this surplus was sold. That was the commodification of agriculture at that time. While the people below them were indebted, they were, the same symptoms operated everywhere. But if you look at, compared to Western UP, if you look at Eastern UP, if you look at Bengal, if you look at much of Bihar, the situation was very different. Commercialization was taking place, but it was taking place through what I collected the term. It was an involuntary commercialization, forced commerce. People were selling because they were indebted. They were selling at a very low price because they had to pay back to the landlord, who was typically, after independence, was typically also their money lender. So they had to, their family money lender, they had to pay back to them. And this is what created a system of what I call a system of forced commerce. So you had the norm, I mean, to put it in very simple, stylized terms, in Western India, the area which you today see as the, what shall I say, the eye of the storm of the farmers' movement was the area where it was the normal commercialization towards the produce, agricultural produce, which was taking place. In Eastern India, it was a forced commercialization where most of the small producers, direct producers, had got into the market, where had become sellers and buyers in the market because of their involvement because of their debt bondage, because they had to pay back the debt, they had to pay back the rent, and so on and so forth to that. Now, this system, and of course, the rent gradually became not rent to the landlord, but to the share, as a sharecropper, to the 1/3 or 2/3 of the share had to be given as rent to the man who owned the land. So the peasant paid a rent and the peasant paid an interest. And in the process, he was left with very little. And every time, to survive till the next harvest, he again borrowed from the landlord on very heavy terms of interest and so on, and paid back. So it was a forced commercialization. And if I can just tell you one very interesting piece of research, which was done by probably one of the best agricultural economists in the country ever, that is Dharamnaran, one of students of K. N. Raj, and Raj also thought so. Dharamnaran had a study quite early on in which he said, market involvement of the peasants from the data seems to be like a V-shaped curve. It goes down, it goes from up, it goes down, and then it goes up again. That is, middle peasants sell very little, whom you call in terms of holding, sell relatively little. Very poor people sell a high proportion of their output because they have to pay back their rent and they have to pay back their, they have to pay their rent, plus they have to pay their the interest on the debt. And at the very high level, you have genuine commercialization. So on the V-shaped curve, the falling part of the V is where you have commercialization actually not going down, but forced commercialization going down. On the upper part, you have forced commercialization disappearing and actual commercialization taking place. Now, the thesis which I offered was that in the forced commerce part, by and large, the people who owned the land, who were collecting the rent and who were collecting also the interest, had much less interest in improving the land compared to the eastern part. In the eastern part, you got the higher produce you produced, you got more money. I mean, the western part, in western UP, for example. Compared to that, if you take eastern UP, for example, if you take any one of the typical, poor East UP districts, the same system on the surface produced a very different thing, because land was taken by, the rent had to be paid, the interest had to be paid, and the landlord always had a lesser incentive to go in for improving the land, because he was getting his rent, he was getting only a share of the produce. So if the production went up from 100 to 200, he will only get half of it. at the same time, the peasant would become better, so he might lose quite a bit of his interest income. So it was always, the people did not do the calculation so exactly. But basically, what developed was a system where you had far less incentive, far less drive to develop agriculture. And you see the contrast very clearly, apart from the later state investment and so on. But state investment also took place in Eastern India. State investment also took place in Bengal, Damodar Valley Corporation, or in parts of Bihar and in parts of, Odisha. But you did not have the same kind of dynamism in agriculture. So this is what I would say is the main thing which I thought was not sufficiently emphasized in understanding Indian agriculture. There was an area where forced commerce was very important, and there was an area where forced commerce was not so important. Ordinary commerce was much more important. So the term commercialization of agriculture included two very different animals. The animal which was normal commercialization, and the animal which was commercialization by force, by the force of debt, by the force of the poverty of the poor peasantry. They were commercialized because they were too poor. And the other one, they were commercialized because they were too rich. They could produce much more than what they. Now, this variety in Indian agriculture, I think, its only advantage is it is, of course, an oversimplification.
You are muted again, Professor Bhaduri.
Okay. Am I all right?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. So you had this difference between those who are those areas which were commercialized by force, because it was forced commercialization, and those areas which were commercialized in the more normal way, is basically the difference which I wanted to say in commercialization. But this also has somewhat quite different implications. For example, if you look at indentured labor in the period, during if some of you read novels, Amitav Ghosh's novel, Sea of Poppies and so on and so forth, the trilogy. The indentured labor basically went in a very large way from Bihar, from Eastern UP. These are the areas where the people are desperate to leave agriculture because they had nothing. They had got into such huge debt that everything was taken away, their land was taken away, there were too many people trying to live off the land, and indentured labor was a form of escape, or what you call a push. On the other hand, there was, for whatever reason, industry grew relatively little in India. This we cannot go into now, but industry grew not sufficiently to attract the classical development of capitalism, which Marx and others talked about. That is, labor gets dispossessed during from the land because of whatever enclosure movement or whatever in Britain. And they create a vagabond class, and then they gradually get inducted into agriculture. This was not a process like this. This process was interfered with another process, and that process was the people being pushed out of agriculture because of their heavy indebtedness, because of the violent form of forced commerce, which a large number of people to leave land, come to the jute industry in Bengal, so to the many other places. Now, I have not said, and I don't think time permits but you see there were contrasts. For example, I studied a very interesting case by somebody who had done a thesis, actually including somebody from Kerala, two theses I read, both of which had a very similar finding. I mean, it was not theory, it was much more, collection of data and tabling of data and so on, tabulation of data and so on. But they found something which I immediately struck my eyes. And that is, for example, if you take Bundelkhand, an area which is pretty badly developed in India, and which was a princely state, what you really had is more or less a survival of neither, what I have said. You had basically what you call the Mughal system continued. That is the relatively bigger people who owned quite a lot of land, but land which was not irrigated at all or very badly irrigated. They had a lot of land, but very little productivity. They would give a small portion of the land to the peasant. It is like in Kerala, you would have homestead land for every peasant, which is a great thing. They would get something like a homestead land, which is from the Mughal system, which is the Kutkash system. They will get the land, but once they get the land, this is the land from which they are supposed to survive. And the rest of the time, their labor is supposed to be spent on the landlord's land. So long as a labor shortage was an important element in agriculture, particularly in Mughal period, you had this system continuing to tie labor to the big lord. You did not have this system in, say, for example, in Bengal. You did not have the system in Bihar, but you had the system in parts of UP. The interesting thing is, they had too little land to survive throughout the year. So it was an agreed system by which for 6 months they cultivated their land, and then there was no water during the other period. So they went away from the land. They actually went to Gujarat and became sugarcane crusher. They hired a sugarcane very often with money given by the landlord. They hired or bought a sugarcane crushing machine, and for 6 months they were self-employed, small, whatever you call it, self-employed small entrepreneurs for 6 months, and they migrated back to the village again to cultivate. Or they became construction workers, like in Rajasthan. Now, in these cases, what I wanted to say is you actually had a different story, a story for people not being able to survive on land. The story I said of forced commerce was that people could not survive on land, and therefore they more and more got involved into debt and tried to meet their debt obligations and their rent obligations by getting more and more into debt and being forced to sell more and more of their produce to the market. Unlike there, what happened in parts of Western UP and in parts of, I'm sure, in Rajasthan, and though I have not seen data, I have only heard stories. You had a system where people worked on the land, and rest of the time they were wage labor. This is a system which you get in Japan also. You got in Japan in the Meiji period. You got a system where people were they were peasant workers. In Japanese, they are called peasant workers. That is, they were peasants for part of the year, and rest of the year they were workers. This was also a system which gradually crept into almost everywhere in India. That is, part of the family worked as wage labor. For example, from Bihar, they came to pull rickshaws in Calcutta streets, from jute mills in Calcutta. people came to work in, and they were wage labor, and either they themselves went back during the harvest time to the land, or part of their family was looking at the land. This is another thing which has not been noticed, and it will be a very interesting topic to work on for those of you who work on agriculture. That is stabilization of the small peasant. And I saw this, I wrote a paper using West Bengal and East Bengal comparison. How did small peasants survive? They did not only survive on debt. They survived on debt because, gradually there were more and more people, they had more children. So the land would get still, further subdivided. But still the small peasant agriculture continued. And one of the reasons which it could continue, it has it has persisted so long, and it is persisting, is paradoxically because agriculture and cities allow a part of the people to come and send back remittances. And these remittances stabilize part of small-scale agriculture. I wanted to say this because this is a good entry point to see that agriculture and industry are also related can be related in a very different way from what we say as the classical Marxist model. Classical model of Marx or anybody who talks of capitalism, that people leave their land after a point. In economics, there are sort of what they call models, stylized pictures made, that people leave their land after a point and move to industry because industry pays more, and gradually there is the industry pulls away the surplus labor from agriculture. All the labor which exists in agriculture, excess labor which exists in agriculture, or too little land, the problem of land gets gradually solved because people find agriculture. This did not obviously happen in India. This did not happen in India. This did not happen actually what people do not realize, and that is my entry point to the contemporary period. I will speak only a little bit on that. Because for whatever reason, and leave out the current period when the growth rate has been negative, industrial growth has not been sufficient to absorb the labor which it needs to absorb from agriculture. It cannot do it. It is not only in Kerala, the unemployment problem is not only severe there, but nowhere. And it is not only the middle class. The peasants who, because of subdivision of land or because of the too much of indebtedness, who want to leave agriculture, they have nowhere else to go. And that is why India, if you look at Indian data, you have the strange system that agricultural output, the contribution of agriculture to national income, has dropped and dropped and dropped. From about nearly half, it has dropped to about 1/5, or less than 1/5, and 17% or 18%. While the number of people who are connected with agriculture has more or less decreased, but decreased very little. From about 80%, it has decreased to 60%. Here, output has decreased much more. One famous Indian economist, V.K.R.V. Rao, was the first one to note it, and now we all know that this is something which has happened in agriculture. I do not know how much of this is an Indian story. This is one thing, because you see, if you look at comparative economic history, and this is the point which I want to make, comparative economic history, you see that England, roughly its industrial revolution, if you put around somewhere around 1820, roughly took 100 to 120 years to absorb the labor from agriculture to industry through the pull factor. In between, for many years, till about 1820 to 1880, according to people like Eric Hobsbawm, for the first 60 years, there was huge surplus labor and very poor work conditions of life both in industry and in agriculture. But it is only after 1880 or so, industrial revolution really started absorbing all the labor. If you look at the American history, the time scale is similar, somewhere around 80 to 90 years, at least 80 years, from the time when they, killed off or shoot away all the local, Red Indians, and took over the land and so on. But that land still, industry to grow, took, and make agriculture a small proportion, only 3 or 4% of the population being on agriculture. That system of change took something like 80 years. If you look at the proportion of people employed in agriculture, you will see that this took a very long time scale. Rural area in Germany is about the same. It took about 60 years. France, if you look at some special areas of south of France, I'm talking only about some major country. It is the same. It took 50 to 60 years for land strength. Now, the first question which I want to ask about contemporary India, and this is not only directly, I'll come to it now, it is not only directly about the present farmers movement, is those who say, and this is not only of one party, this is not only true of the BJP, this is also true of Congress, particularly Congress after 1991, when they took whatever you call it, neoliberalism or whatever the word you want, the becoming a market economy connected to the world much more seriously. Do you have this time scale? Even countries of Eastern Asia, like let us say success stories, South Korea, Singapore, to a lesser extent, but even Malaysia, they all took 25 to 30 years to get this process going. India also had this process now for at least more than 70 years. But the whole problem is, in these countries, you had at best a kind of managed democracy. You did not have the regular 5-year election and so on. Now, if you have 5-year election, and if you have to win elections if you have to get the popular sanction, popular vote every 5 years, a verdict every 5 years in your favor, can you subscribe to a time scale where you say that we will industrialize and we'll get it? I remember I got mad with one of my former friends, he is no longer there, but who was very important, the CPM, when this Singur Nandigram thing was going on. When he said that, all right, they will not get jobs, but 2-3 generations they can at least work on, as the wives can work, as when he lost the argument, when I started telling him that, this is the time scale which you require for moving from agriculture to industry. So what are you doing by taking away land from the peasant? What kind of model do you want to develop? How democracy survive in this situation? And his last argument was, well, they can become domestic servants. Now, this is what actually these people resist. I think at one level, the resistance to land acquisition everywhere in India, whether it is an Adivasi area or whether it is a area which has never been politically very active like Rajasthan, when it comes to land acquisition, this is the first reason why there is such a resistance, because it is a threat to their livelihood in the sense you cannot do it. And this threat has been increased. This threat was usually for people whose land is being taken away, and they were usually by and large small peasants and people connected with agriculture in various ways, as wage labor, as sharecroppers, and so on and so forth. But for the first time, with these 3 laws, the government is trying to commercialize the product market. If I can go back to what I was saying earlier, the government is trying to commercialize the product market. And this commercialization, which basically means the corporatization, so there will be no floor. there will be no minimum price which the farmer will get. Already there is uncertainty, already there is indebtedness, and for most farmers, the situation is pretty precarious. And if they don't even have the uncertainty of the price in these areas, even the surplus farmers will soon feel that they will have no place to go. This is the same situation which I said about West Bengal and my debate with my CPM friend, that you cannot do this because it is a wrong policy, not only moral, but this is a wrong policy if you even actually study history. And this is the point which I want you to see. Very important it is, not to fall for simply slogans. I mean, we have solved the agricultural problem. I remember Buddhadev Bhattacharya saying, we have solved the problem of agriculture, we'll now solve the problem of industry by industrializing, by taking away land and so on. Apart from everything else, this is an absurd proposition because the time scale simply does not matter. Either you cannot have a 5-year democracy and win elections, and you do this all the time. If you try to do it, sink. The second thing which I wanted to say is, when you try to commercialize agriculture, even of surplus areas where farmers are relatively well off, like in many of Punjab and so on, when you make them poor without setting an alternative system, when you put them to the uncertainty that the price is not sure and so on, and very soon Adanis and Ambanis will come into the picture. Well, Adanis are already there. They have more silos than the surplus grains which the farmers of Punjab can produce to hold it. And Ambanis are already there in retail trade in a big way. So it is not that whatever they say, it is not that they are not there. The farmers are right that they are already there. But the basic problem is not one of political theory of the system becoming oligarchic and losing its democracy and so on. That's important. But what is far more important is that the poor people who depend, and this is the peculiarity of of any Indian agriculture certainly, that the poor people, the agricultural workers, the small peasants, who partly get their support from the big peasants in terms of loan and so on, depending on what area, what context and so on, they all feel threatened. And if you go to the Punjab area today, not Punjab area, if you go to the Singlu border, where you often see on the TV here, you will see that it is peasants, not only rich peasants. It is not only even caste in, Jats, and they are not Jat. They are not only Sardars, but also very poor, scheduled caste Sardars. I mean, almost for the first time, you are seeing a movement where being threatened, they all are joining. Earlier, people joined because their land was being taken. Kerala had a good land reform system. Bengal also had a good land reform system, and that is what kept the CPM in power. But this is no longer a question of land. This is a question of what I started by saying, that it is a commercialization, forced commercialization of the product market. Very soon, the forced commercialization of the product market, by reducing the price more and more, will force even the middle rich farmers to, drastically have lower income. And this income will also mean that they will, all the people who, like agricultural workers and so on, will lose. And more important, the public distribution system would be jeopardized because there will be no procurement. And this is why the poor and the rich, unlike in the classical Marxist case, the poor and the rich, you can see it with your own eyes, the poor and the rich are coming together in all these Mahapanchayats. And this is actually, I do not think it happened in India before. I mean, I have been to many land acquisition areas and directly seen them in different parts of India. it has always been a fight over land. And those who had land, they were afraid of losing their livelihood. And with them joined also some people who were depending on that land in various ways for their livelihood, like agricultural sharecroppers, migrant labor, wage laborers and so on. But this is the first time when village after village is joining. And this is what is novel about the movement. And this is where to say that India is going to move towards an industrialized economy is a kind of illiterate stupidity. Those who do not know history will either repeat it or repeat it very badly. And I cannot, stop from giving one of my favorite quotes. Somebody who was a Marxist and said you cannot go beyond Marxism in the modern age, that is Jean-Paul Sartre. He once said that, in a debate, I think in a lecture, that you see the biggest ideological ideological crime of Stalinism after he became disillusioned with the Soviet system, that the biggest ideological crime of Stalinism was that it said for industrialization we will sacrifice a couple of generations. You can't. In history, particularly in a democratic history, if you try to do it, either the democracy goes or you go. I think we are at that point. Thank you. Okay, I'm finished.
Thank you so much, Professor Bhaduri, for that layered and complex discussion, historicizing the present moment in ways that were unpredictable and really very exciting. I have to make an announcement, and before we open it up for discussion, I want to make an announcement and also invite Professor Michael Taragan, the chairperson of KCHR, who has joined us for the meeting, to say a few words. The announcement is that for efficiently managing time, could people type in their questions into the chat box. We will read it out to Professor Bhaduri and he can respond. So instead of asking questions, it's better if you type your questions into the chat box. Michael, would you like to share a few words?
I mean, don't expect me to be more tech savvy.
No, that's fine.
I will simply talk.
Yes, that's fine. No, the others will be tech savvy and they will type it in and we will read it out.
Okay. I don't have to speak, somebody will.
Yes. May I request Dr. Rachel Varghese to read out the questions, please? Because I think Professor Michael Taragan's system seems to have frozen. When he can rejoin us, we will ask him to speak a few words.
I don't think his microphone is off, so that needs to be turned on.
Mine, is it?
Hello.
No, Sachi,
Hello?
It's not that. It's, yes, Michael.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you. Yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to tell Professor Amit Bhaduri that I was one of the 7 students who in the first batch of MPhil in Applied Economics in the CDS under Professor K.N. Raj. And from those days onwards, have been a ardent follower of your thoughts and your writings. I wish to thank you once more for agreeing to come and talk to the KCHR through the KCHR's platform. I stop here and make way for many people who would be wanting.
Thank you. What is your name, you said?
Thank you. My name is Michael Taragan.
Can you just tell me your name?
My name is
yes,
Michael M-I-C-H-A-E-L Tarakan. I was the only historian in that group. And then
Raj was there. You were there.
Yeah, Raj was my.
I was staying with Raj.
Yeah.
I was staying with Raj at that time. Yeah.
Yes. And Raj was my mentor, and and practically academically everything. I stop here. That's all.
Can I request Dr. Rachel Verghese to please read out the questions and comments?
Yes. Okay. Sir, I'll read out the first question. It's from Rajiv Sutradhar. My question, sir, is did UK really manage to absorb all labor that left agriculture? Part of them made to other countries such as Australia, North America, options that are not available to them in India.
What shall I do? Shall I answer each question separately, one by one?
Yeah. Yes, sir. Please, can you please state
I
it?
think it's a very important thing, and I partly because I forgot and partly because of shortage of time, that you see the escape route of, shall we say, imperialism, the escape route of having colonies was open to England. It was also open to, as you know, it was also open to all the major Western countries. It also became open to America in terms of its relation with Latin America. But there is one very major difference, and that is your question. In England, from England, if you know, a very large number of people went to Australia, for example. And you know, the middle class, the lower middle class, quite a few of them came to India, you know, Africa and so on, because Britain had a huge empire. The interesting thing is that the same problem was solved in a different way by American, well, semi-imperialism or whatever you call it, in Latin America. There it was, you see, exactly the thing I was talking about, commercialization of agriculture within India. Internationally also something like, not something like that. It is the same thing that you have different markets and their commercialization takes place in a sequence. Large American firms like United Fruit Corporation went to, hello? Yes. United Fruit Corporation went to Guatemala, and you know, so you had a three-way migration here. You had from much of Europe, you had a huge migration to the United States, which took away their surplus labor from agriculture, to answer your question. Actually, from Norway, 1 in 3 migrated. Ireland, 1 in 3 migrated. 1/3 of the population more or less left. You know, and they were all poor people and so on. Same in Greece, Italy, and so on. And relatively well-off people, the so-called Mayflower children, lived in America. This escape route now you do not have either in India or in China. You not only don't have this escape route, you also don't have the escape route of getting all your raw materials from poorer countries. I mean, to some extent, China is trying, India to a lesser extent, because India does not have that kind of power. But you are absolutely right. Industrialization is a process which in the Western world cannot thought of without imperialism. And the surplus labor also cannot be thought of without imperialism. This was a very important escape route for them. But that escape route is also another type of international commercialization. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. The next query is from Vedant Wangde. The question is, what do you mean by commercialization of agriculture?
Well, I was trying to explain that this is precisely commercialization of agriculture. For normally, if you take normal English language, commercialization of agriculture means the agriculture produce being commercialized, agriculture produce being sold in the market. And when more and more agriculture produce is sold in the market, you call it a more commercialized agriculture. That's a normal use of the term. What I was trying to say that this is an oversimplification, because commercialization of agriculture basically means several markets at the same time, where what they produce or what they had was not being bought and sold before, is now being bought and sold. Like land. If you take feudal times, land was not bought and sold, or almost not bought and sold. If you take, for example, credit, the credit very often came in terms of a social custom that you borrowed from your rich relative or from the village, and so on. There were various arrangements by which you borrowed. If you take, for example, capital, very often, in Eastern UP, in Bengal, in parts of Bihar, they were given one hull. Every peasant, and even now in Africa, for example, is a very prevalent system. You are given in places like Ethiopia and so on. And I have seen that you are given the amount of land which you can cultivate. And that amount of land is determined in terms of the amount of capital you have. In Ethiopia, for example, it depends on bullock. With two bullocks, a certain amount of land you can cultivate, and you are given that. In Bengal, it is called hal, akhal land, one hal of land, which means basically with one plow, how much you can calculate, how much you can cultivate. Now, all these things except for the product, everything else in the usual term of commercialization is not thought of. But actual commercialization means these things gradually getting commercialized. I started by mentioning Marx. Marx, for example, talked of commercialization of labor power. Okay. Or you could do a similar thing, commercialization of slave labor. You capture the slaves and you bring them as commodities and sell them in the market. Now this becomes a commercialization of human beings. This becomes a commercialization of human being trafficking. Similarly, it becomes a commercialization of labor power. It can become a commercialization of credit. It can become a commercialization of how much of your land and so on. So I tried to extend the notion to answer your question, I tried to extend the notion of commercialization beyond the usual idea that it is only commercialization of product. In today's farm laws, if you see, most of the people who talk about TV and so on, they are completely, they have exactly the same problem. They are completely oblivious to the fact that commercialization of agriculture is not only commercial. It is the farmers who know. The farmers are saying that first we'll get a back price for our produce, and then we'll lose our land, we'll get into more debt, which we already are in debt, but we will not be able to pay, more suicides and so on. But they know the connections. But if you look at the so-called agricultural experts, what do most of them on the TV, what do they talk about? Are we giving a good price including our Prime Minister? Are we giving a good price to the farmers? Are we not giving a good price to the farmers? They are only talking about the product market. But there are lots of other consequences of the product market not giving a good price, or the land market not being extremely skewed. So think of commercialization as a whole set of markets which are getting. It is commodification, or it is buying and selling of commodities in various markets. Markets for input and markets for output. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Hello.
The next
Hello.
query
Hello.
is from the Sorry, the next query is from Professor Susan Vishwanath. Thank you for your talk, which placed the present farmers' movement in the historical context of understanding Rajvari. I presume that the agricultural income coming down to 16% doesn't take into account the use value of produce as farmers' families substantially put aside for their consumption. Is it for this reason, as you have shown, that migrant labor returned home and are resisting farm loss?
Sorry, I didn't get the question. What is the question?
Sir, I'll read it out once more. Thank you for your talk, which placed the present farmers' movement in the historical context of understanding Rajvari. I presume that the agricultural income coming down to 16% doesn't take into account the use value of produce as farmers' families substantially put aside for their consumption. Is it for this reason, as you have shown, that migrant labor returned home and are resisting farm loss? It's from Professor Susan Vishwanath.
Well, I'm not very clear, but if I understand the question correctly, what you're trying to say that 16% is actually what exactly is income, in the sense that it is a contribution of the agricultural sector to national income. It does not mean that the farmer gets 16% income. It is the value of their produce which they sell in the market, right? Now,
so surely we are very concerned about the fact that even minimum produce doesn't match the costs of production. So that problem of use value.
Oh, I see. I see.
And I would say 80%, because if it's down to 60%, we know after COVID-19 that people returned home. So the seasonal labor that you talked about so persuasively, and I think it's a very interesting area to work on, the very basis of this return home, this continuous return home, actually shows us that the nation is supported by its ability to feed itself, which the government is now taking away. So we share your panic, obviously. And I think a new generation has to work on this, because Indian people have been able to feed themselves, and this is taken away from them now.
Yes. This is very much so. You see, you have 3 layers of gross differences in productivity, and then I will come to the migrant labor in a minute who returned home. You see, the first is the formal and the informal sector. If you look at it a little bit more, the informal sector has 92% roughly of the workforce, produces slightly less than half the national income. That means its average productivity compared to the nation, the national average, is about half. If you take agriculture, it produces about 16%, as you said. I think a little bit more, 18%. Anyway, if it produces 16%, it still has something over 50% of that, depending on how you take the animal husbandry and mining and so on. But certainly it has more than 50% of the labor. So you have a further reduction in terms of national productivity. I would have formulated the question that as compared to the average productivity of the nation, the productivity of the informal sector is way low, about half, and half of the informal sector's productivity is the productivity of agriculture. So you're absolutely right that agriculture has very little ability to sustain, and that is the basic reason why the movement is spreading. This has been going on for a long time. It has been going on for a long time. Certainly, it is not the problem which has just been created by the present government, but the present government has made it far worse. The deteriorating position of agriculture, and on top of that, now they're saying that we'll corporatize it. Now, migrant labor, this is what I said. Actually, at one point of my talk, I said that, some persistence of small farms. and I gave the example of Japan also, the so-called the worker peasant, that many people come to the cities so that their farm, they do not lose their farm. They get supplementary income, they send same remittances. Well, in Kerala, I don't have to say. I mean, you know how much remittance income helped the Kerala economy. You just have to travel in Kerala to see. Now it is a bit less, but when the boom was going on, how much remittance income came in. In a very small way, it was a remittance income from the city, which comes to the villages. But you see, what the government is doing is putting the cart before the horse. You cannot take away people from agriculture. You cannot give them job in industry. And on the other hand, you are saying that you will still have to, I will commercialize it. So whom would it help? It will help nobody. And the agricultural workers should naturally resist, because what they were able to earn, as you know, what they were able to earn in cities were, in spite of everything, was, as I already gave the overall statistics, they earned much more than what an agricultural worker was. As I said, in informal sector, most of people earn half of the national average. In agriculture, they earn half of what these people earn. So very approximately speaking, without any field data and so on, you can easily say that if an average agricultural worker earned on a day, let us say 4 to 500 rupees, when he comes back to the village and he gets something, he will not get more than 200, 250 rupees. And naturally, this is, this would be much more difficult at that level to sustain himself. And that is the problem. And that is why the NREGA has been so important, which the government stupidly has also again cut. Thank you.
The next query is from Raghav Chakravarti. Professor Bhaduri, could you comment on the prospects of agriculture demand-led industrialization at the current juncture? The prospects of agricultural demand-led industrialization in India at the current juncture.
Well, one-line answer is it is very poor, because already you see that agriculture has, as we are just saying in the last question answer, that agriculture only produces 16% of the income. So how much output can it produce? How much demand for industry can it generate? Actually, this is one of the basic problem of Indian development. That is, you see, the reason why industry does not grow at the required rate to absorb people from agriculture, if you go by the classical model, that people will move out of agriculture and go to industry and so on. The reason why it does not happen is, one of the biggest problems is there is not enough demand for industrial products. Industrial products can only grow at 2%, 3%, can absorb only 2%, 3% of growth. And at the same time, if you want to make industry, and this is the point which I should say, take, for example, land. Take a piece of land on which 10 people work, make a livelihood. They don't make a good livelihood in today's agriculture. They have about a livelihood which is 1/3 the national average. But they have some sort of a livelihood there. If you take the poorer among them. Now the land is taken away from them. So 10 people get unemployed. Demand is relatively little. Industry is quite capital, uses a lot of capital. So opportunity for giving job in industry is much less. So most of the output is produced by labor, which has a very high output per head. So every labor produces. So if 20 people, this is something which even as historians, I think you should know as an arithmetical example. Suppose there were 10 people which are employed, this is my favorite example, each produces a very low output, which I would say, per head, which is 2. So they were producing 20. Now you destroy the livelihood of these 10 people, you take away the land, you give it to industry or for highway or whatever it is, which this government is hell-bent on doing. You give this, you replace this 20 units of output with industrial output, which is about, in India, which is about at least 8 times agricultural output. You know, a worker in industry produces 8 times more than a worker in agriculture. So how many people can you absorb? 3 people. You displace 10 people, but you can absorb 3 people. You know, people get very surprised. For example, when you are given the actual data, I studied it in great detail in 2-3 cases. In the case of, you know, one in Orissa, one in Bengal, and one actually in Kerala. In all these cases, what you find is the people who can be, you know, like the Adani port, how many jobs would it give? For every, you know, for every job it creates, it will take about 7 to 8 jobs in for the people who are on that land. You know, or the fisherman's job if it is a port. So this business is an unending business because, you know, you take away so many people's jobs, you make so many people's, take away so many people's livelihood. On the other hand, you have a constraint of demand. So you can only, and high productivity of labor. Labor is highly productive in industry compared to agriculture, 8 times more. So you can only give so few people a job. You know, you take, in this example, you take away 10 people, so you can give at best 3 people the job. And this is what makes jobless growth when growth takes place. Now, of course, it's much worse. Growth is not taking place. And on top of that, they're taking away, you know, they're talking of taking away land and so on. Thank you.
The next query is from, sorry, sir.
Yes, I was just saying, so, you know, industry cannot be sustained in India, cannot be sustained by, for the time being, by income of agriculture. You first have to increase the productivity of small scale land. Actually, Kerala, in spite of all its problems, is probably the closest to that. Partly because of the, you know, land holding system, structure and so on. But productivity of land, not productivity of labor in agriculture, but productivity of land in agriculture has to be increased. And there is enough opportunity for this in the whole of Eastern India, in the whole of, you know, Rajasthan, Bihar, by small irrigation, drip irrigation, water management, so on and so forth. I mean, if Israel could do it, why not India? Thank you.
The next query is from Manish Manhar. Does commercialization of agriculture lie at the root cause of most of the farmers' movement?
Most of the?
Farmers' movements.
No. Until this one, I mean, I'm talking about the period which I personally know reasonably well. That is, let us say, from 2000. There have been an enormous number of movement, farmers' movement, and they are not about commercialization of agriculture in the normal sense of the term, because in the normal sense of the term, commercialization of agriculture means commercialization of product, what the agriculture produce. That has not been the main reason. The main reason has been commercialization of land. You know, that is, in the tribal areas, for example, it is direct. You take away land and you give it to the industry or you give it to the state, and it is the land which is not actually commercialized, but it is the land which is taken away from the peasants for other purposes by direct, you know, by direct state action. When the state tries to buy the land, or when the state acts as an intermediary to sell the land, basically to make land commercialization possible, which Modi, for example, has openly said, the term they use is, if you notice, Modi very often says this is the next step which they want to do if they succeed in this. which they call monetization of agriculture. Monetization of land basically means the land would be freely bought and sold in the market. The government will take the land, or the private industries, would be allowed to directly buy the land by paying the farm. Now, this monetization of land is when what we are seeing the farmers' movement today everywhere in India. The farmers' movement today is the movement to stop government to take the land, and the government takes it at a relatively low price and then give it to the SEZ or to the land bank, or directly to some farmers, to some industries for building industry. For example, if you take all the areas which are resource rich, it's impossible. If you look at all the areas where big dams have been built, in all these areas there are more and more of resistance, precisely because people do not know where to go. It is a Jean-Paul Sartre problem. It is the ideological crime we talked about, that you think for industry you can sacrifice 3 generations of the grandfather, the son, and the grandson, and you can get through I don't know in other systems, but certainly you cannot get through it if you have a democracy of any kind.
Hello. Sir.
So it is not commercialization in the sense of commercialization of product, but it's commercialization of land with the intention of commercializing land, what is being done. This is the first movement. The current movement is the first movement where it is about commercialization of agriculture, commercialization of product market. That's what I was trying to explain.
Thank you.
Yes.
Then we have another question from Satya Pathak. How will the socio-economic convergence be affected if this forced commercialization process continues? Please put some light on it in the context of institutional capability.
Can you just repeat it?
Sir, how will the socio-economic convergence be affected if this forced commercialization process continues?
What will converge?
How will the socio-economic convergence?
Oh.
How will the socio-economic convergence be affected if this forced commercialization process continues? Please put some light on it in the context of institutional capability.
You mean between caste and class? Social economic convergence in terms of caste and class, for example.
Oh, sir, may I speak?
Yes, I don't understand fully.
Yes.
Yes, sir. By socioeconomic convergence, I meant convergence in socioeconomic measurements, which we usually use to see the development in a state or in a particular community.
Oh, you mean some index which you use?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Well, to be really correct, I should say that without seeing the index and the weights which you give, I cannot really say. But at a broader level, I think forced commerce basically means what? Basically, it means that you are not terribly interested in, to put it very crudely, you are not terribly interested in the production only. Because of your interest in income comes from rent, and your interest in income comes from from getting other sources of income, like from from interest rate, which you want, paid interest rate, and so on. Now, the other sources of income, if these other sources of income are more important, including not only in this case, but in other cases, it's also, say, non-agricultural activities, which are quite important and which are actually more important in India now than income from agricultural activities in most parts of India. If the non-agricultural, which are about 55 and 45, I think, if the non-agricultural income is about, very high, the convergence might actually, it might work towards convergence. If it's an index, the index might convert in terms of the fact that the reduction in agricultural output is more than compensated by the increase in the, statistically speaking, the increase in the non-commercial activity. For example, you reduce the price of paddy, okay, let us say by 10%, but you increase the price of, let us say, something which is non-agricultural produce. Let us say you increase the some service. Say people are doing a lot of service in terms of house building and so on. You increase the price of that. So the convergence might take place in terms of that, if that is the question you are asking. But without seeing the index, what goes into the index, how can I answer? Thank you.
So we have come to the end of the typed queries. There is a specific request for a direct query. So I think before we wind up, we can take just this one question. Ma'am, if you wish, you may please speak.
What done?
Yeah, okay, ma'am. There is a raised hand. So,
Hello.
ma'am, you may please speak. Yes.
Hello.
Yes, you may please speak.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
May I speak? Sir. Sir, my doubt is one general question. Not only agriculture, everything is commercialized nowadays. I would like to get a clarification from you. It is, in my opinion, economics should be based on a norm. That norm must be the happiness of people. What is your opinion?
I have a very favorite story, which I did not say in this lecture, but I very often repeat it.
Okay.
And I think that will answer your question. That when the United States was, the CIA in America was supporting many of the Latin American dictatorships.
Yes.
I was living in Mexico at that time, and this was a story which was going around in the, in sort of gossips going around, that one of the Latin American dictators went to the United States and said, for military aid, and he said, sir, to the President of the United States, sir, I need more military aid because there is a lot of tension building up in the country. People are not happy. We're talking about people are not happy, so we require more military assistance from you. So the President of the United States said, but why? Is your economy in a very bad shape? So he said, no, sir, the economy is doing fine. We have a very high growth rate, but the people are not happy. You see, basically, your question, the answer to your question is quite straightforward. If you delink growth from distribution, like this government is doing, I just saw the, whatever the name is, the chief economic advisor, saying that, now we are growth oriented. We are not oriented towards the distribution, and we are not oriented towards, giving doles and so on. What you forget is growth and distribution are not two different issues. How you grow defines what your distribution is going to be. Everything is commercialized means what? Everything is commercialized also means that you have commercialized the whole ownership of every national resources in the extreme cases. This is what the government is trying to do with agriculture. You know, commercialization of, let us say, the stock market. The stock market is booming, the stock market is doing very well because that is commercialized. You know, some rich people are buying and selling the stocks. More people are buying stocks than selling at the top. So the stock prices go up. But has it got anything to do with the economy, real people's happiness? No, at every stage. You can say it about, you know, very good sort of high-class housing. You can say it about car. If your very expensive cars do well, does it mean that the economy is doing well? If you see the TV, you will think yes. You know, and if you hear some of the people talking on the TV, you will think yes, because the GDP is going up. But it is not that. In every economy, the growth and the mechanism by which the output of the growth is distributed are linked. So happiness, there is a larger definition of happiness, which will take us to the notion of alienation, take us to the notion of, you know, satisfaction with, and which certainly does not come with only with money, and it does not come only with commodities. But even if you stick to more philosophical, leave out that greater philosophical question and talk about only about, you know, limited happiness, material happiness, even to get the basic needs satisfied, you know, you need to have a system of distribution where the growth gets distributed. And that is the one which is getting worse and worse affected. And this is the moral of the story. The economy is doing well, but the people are not. And now, of course, the economy is not even doing well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Professor Bhaduri. We have come to the end of our question and answer session now. On behalf of the KCHR, we wish to thank you again for being a part of this platform. We could not have had a better start for our interventions series. And thank you for answering and engaging with the audience through the question and answer session. I also wish to thank all the participants on behalf of KCHR. We look forward to seeing you in our other programs as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.